it's been circumstances rather than nature that put women into the place they were in the 19th century. Since it's circumstances, one needs to change the circumstances.
Right.
Give them the vote, give them the ability to enter into the labor force on, an equal footing with men.
Hello, and welcome to another installment of the Essential Scholars podcast. Today, I'm going to be joined by Sandra Peart, and we're going to have part 2 of our conversation about John Stuart Mill. Professor Peart is the Dean, as well as the E. Claiborne Robbins Distinguished Professor in Leadership Studies at the University of Richmond. She's the author of our essential John Stuart Mill book, as well as many other wonderful works in economic history. So great to have you back to have part 2 of our John Stuart Mill chat.
Thank you. I'm really looking forward to this.
So last time we went through, his intellectual influences, the ideas and contributions of John Stuart Mill. But today, I would love to talk a little bit about what are the kinds of policy conversations that John Stuart Mill's ideas can help us gain a little bit more insight into those things.
We talked a little bit about speech last time, and I think that's one area that we might want to explore. In Chapter 5 of On Liberty, Mill gives us a number of applications of the restrictions that he thinks are adequate or justified on choice. He very much focuses on the consumer in that chapter, and so it might be things like, in terms of today's applications, you might think of things like seat belts, for instance, regulations on that make us wear seat belts as opposed to giving us the choice to wear seat belts, or restrictions on the sales of goods that might be dangerous for us to consume. So he talks about alcohol, but you could imagine, all sorts of other goods of that sort, drugs and so on. And when he, as I said earlier, when he explores those issues, he very much, as I say, focuses on the consumer. So it's not so much that they should be forbidden to be produced, but there might be regulations in terms of who can consume goods and in what capacities and so on. So that's another sort of broad issue. And then, of course, there's taxation, which is, super important today. And then there's I would want us to think about how much he's in favor of it. Lots of experimentation, which today can be in the productive realm as well as in the consumptive realm.
So I'd love to talk a little bit about his views about goods that can be harmful to ourselves. So you had brought up drugs and alcohol. If I recall, it's been a minute since I've read On Liberty, but if I recall, he really seemed to be more in favor of, like, your community members, if somebody has a problem consuming those goods, kind of stepping up and if a family member of mine, for example, is struggling with alcohol problems, he would encourage me or other family members to kind of speak up and challenge that. So what's the role for, the community, civil society versus where the state might need to step in?
Yeah, absolutely. So, goods that might entail harm to oneself and to others. So harm to yourself, is one category, but then harm to others is where he really kind of focuses in On Liberty. So, applying that no harm principle. And there he does talk about alcohol. So he would suggest then that there could be regulations in the sense of lots of information being made known to consumers. So, the dangers of this good, that sort of thing. Labels on goods that are poisonous, for instance, that might have several uses, not all of which are harmful. Go ahead and sell those, but make sure people know that they're dangerous before they purchase them or as they purchase them. But then, as you say, goods that might involve harm to others. So, for instance, if one were to overconsume a product and then leave the local pub, he's talking about these little pubs on the corner and so on. There definitely would be a role for others to kind of step in, and so civil society for him, one's family and then one's community members, whether those are the people we work with or the people we go to church with or whatever, who are in similar circumstances to us, they take on a very important role in terms of kind of making sure that we look after one another, and not even just that, but making sure that we know what's approved of, so that for John Stuart Mill, as for Adam Smith, there's this role of sympathy or sympathetic approval or approbation. So we know it's not okay to go out and overconsume this good and then put others at risk. So there's this role for us to police ourselves, but although there is also, of course, in his view, a role for police to police ourselves, but it's not a sort of constant watching in terms of the policing, the actual physical police. But there is among us as community members a sense, and he sometimes he thinks it could be even too overwhelming. So the sense that public opinion could help us behave a certain way or make certain choices. And he's kind of walking this dance between having that be useful, but then knowing it could be, a little bit like Big Brother.
And I was going to bring up, because he seems in other cases really frustrated with social norms and social conventions, from his personal experiences and the effect that they had on women's choices.
Yes, exactly. So, he lived that, as we talked about in the last episode, he lived that in the sense that, he was disgraced and sort of, made to lose his friendships and his relationships with his family because of public opinion. So he knows that public opinion can play a detrimental role sometimes, if it isn't in line with, if it's sort of, overly applied first, but also not in line with what's actually right or what choices we should be allowed to make. So he realizes that that public opinion can play a negative role, but he also sees that it can play a positive role if it's enforcing or reinforcing us to learn to make reasonable choices.
So I wonder if his view of competition over, speech and competition of ideas, if that is a really important thing to have at play when we're thinking about the, push and pull of new social norms and conventions.
Right, absolutely. So, in speech, he wants to see lots of speech and lots of discussion and discussing new ideas and experimentation and so on. And it's how we learn, right? By exchanging ideas with each other and by making choices. So we can talk about things, but that's one thing, and it's extremely important. But then by actually making the choices, he says, learn actually more deeply. So you can be told that if you press your tongue against a cold metallic element in the middle of winter, that it will hurt, or if you touch a burner on a stove, that it will hurt. And you can learn that as a young person, but you learn it much more fully, he would say, if you actually experiment. Now, in that case, the experiment doesn't really work, or it's not not a particularly great one. But yes, speech absolutely is a situation in which, or a phenomenon that he thinks is critically important for learning. And it's how we learn. First we learn about what ideas are wrong, right? So we correct ourselves through the interaction of speech. And then even if we have the right idea, we learn it more fully by debating it, discussing it, by explaining it to someone else.
Mm-hmm.
If you've ever, had to be a teacher or been a teacher, you know that, you can learn microeconomics in your microeconomics class, but then when you actually show it to someone else, explain it to someone else, you learn it more deeply. And he understood that phenomenon.
Yeah, I definitely know that to be true from my own personal experiences.
Right.
So one thing you brought up reminded me of nudges when you were talking about John Stuart Mill's views of kind of the role for the state. Libertarian paternalism comes to mind. So for those who don't know, there was a book several years back called Nudge by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein. And it made a very big splash in the policy world. I think even several governments have little nudge departments within their regulatory agencies. So can you speak to that? Is that an idea that is very consistent with Mill's thoughts?
Yes. So sometimes Mill comes close to sounding like a paternalist, but I don't think he is one. I think he thinks that we reform ourselves. So he's very much, he thinks that we can all improve. But the way improvement happens is through a sort of internal and external discussion with oneself and with others. So you and I have a conversation. We talk about how we should exercise more. We debate about, how much more, what ways we should exercise more, and eventually, I come to realize that, well, I should add a couple miles to the runs that I take each week, or something like that. But it's very internal. It's not that a government has informed me through some sort of messaging or nudging that, when I get up today, I should take my run. The way he does skirt with what could be thought of as nudging or paternalism is this idea of public opinion. So, if public opinion is out there telling me that I should be taking my extra run this week, and then that could be thought of as a kind of nudge. Now, it's not one that's necessarily sponsored by the state, although it could be. And his sense that there is a danger in the kind of control that public opinion could exert on each of us, I think is what makes him not a paternalist. The way you can kind of interpret him as a paternalist is if you think, okay, well, he's letting public opinion do a lot of work. And it is true that public opinion has a role, but the fact that he's also got this very important role for discussion and speech, and you and I interacting freely without someone, imposing their views on us, I think is what makes him an anti-paternalist. So I would put him on the non-nudge side of the sort of economic spectrum.
All right, that's good to know. I wasn't really sure in reading a little bit more. Some of the, providing information, those less intrusive type of nudges seem consistent, but perhaps it's you want competition over where that information is coming from. You don't necessarily want it to be coming from just the state, just one source.
Right. And the other thing I would say is, he doesn't like this idea of settled opinions. Right? He's very opposed to that. So it's not that, we all decide that, some good is bad for us, and we never question that decision going forward. We constantly need to be questioning, and he's very much opposed to this sort of decided opinion, and letting it rest at that. Now, just to complicate things a little bit, I would like to mention taxation, because he does write that he's the originator, in my view, of the idea of a sin tax. You could think of sin tax as kind of a nudge. So the reason the way he approaches this is he says, well, the government and this is a time when there is no income tax and there is a state, so they need some revenue. And he says, well, they do need some revenue. Given they need revenue, one of the things they could do is tax goods that we know are not good for us. So tax alcohol, for instance, and so, there's where we, as I say, get the idea of taxing goods that would then induce us to consume less of them. And I just said, well, he doesn't want the science to settle on this. So, would we tax them forever? Possibly not, if we come to realize that something's not as bad as we thought it was, or whatever.
That would require our political institutions to have some sort of like a sunset clause where we revisit things periodically.
Which, of course, doesn't happen.
The public choice school would suggest there's a bit of inertia on the part of the political process when it comes to those types of things.
And I'll just say that's something he really doesn't address.
So easier talked about than implemented in practice, like many, many things that we economists like to talk about.
Yes.
One thing I found interesting about Mill's view of speech, it's not that, just that we come to understand our own view a little bit better, but we do come to appreciate another's point of view. So there's that moderating of the tone of our speech and making sure that we're not being obnoxious with our opinions because we actually want people to consider them seriously.
Right.
How do you think social media has affected that competition? Because if I just use like academic Twitter as an example, like I steer clear of Twitter because it's very mean. People are very, very mean. And so, do you think there's something different about that social media space that maybe Mill's view of competing ideas is there's something going on that it's not quite working out the way it would work if we were talking in person?
Yes, so I think that's an excellent point, and there's an additional point that I want to make related to it. But let me start with that. So yes, his notion of speech, it may be archaic. It may not actually work today in the way that it did in the 19th century. Although, even then people were shouting at each other. Parliament was a very vigorous place to, speak and so on. And he's not just talking about Parliament, but the other sources of speech as well. So it may be that we are losing our ability to listen, and that he's really relying on when he writes about speech. And certainly it's true that, in these very short bursts of speech, whether they're, the 9-second soundbite or the speech that you see on Twitter, that's not the kind of speech that really works the way he wants speech to work. And so I think that is a problem. There's been a technological change, but also there may be some neurological changes that are happening now as a result of the kind of speech that we're subjecting each other to. So that's a challenge, I think, for Mill. And, if you think about when Mill is writing, people are speaking in Parliament, or giving speeches at the local city hall and so on, that would be easily more than an hour. People would listen to that speech before they reply to it and so on, and absorb at least much of it, and so on. So really, there is quite a difference. The other thing I would mention, so there's technological change, but the other thing that I think I would mention is that it may be that we are more engaged in faction than we were in the 19th century. And again, not to say that there wasn't political parties, which there were back then, Tories and Whigs and so on. But today it seems like we're speaking more within our faction than we were perhaps in the 19th century. And he does write that, through speech, you can, he says you can change the minds of some people who are sort of toward the middle, but you can't change the minds of those who are, way far away from you, kind of socially or politically or whatever. So he's aware of the idea of faction, and the fact that some people just won't change their minds. But he thinks that those factions are a little bit more permeable, perhaps, than they become today. So 2 challenges to him.
Yeah. So one thing that I think about that social media space is that there is a little bit more of a level of anonymity there, in a way that, giving a public speech is more closely tied to my reputation.
Yes.
So that might be one element.
So interestingly, I'll just mention he was not in favor of a secret ballot.
I did recall reading that.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear more about that.
Right. Well, so it has to do with this anonymity. He thinks that if you can hide behind anonymity, you will do things differently than you would if you have to actually make public what your choices are. And so, and again, it's it's this kind of interesting dance with public opinion. If you know that public opinion will judge you poorly if you make a particular choice, then you shouldn't be able to hide behind a lie or voting silently and not making that choice known to others if you know it's right and you're going to claim that you've done something else. So it's an interesting argument, and it's a little surprising when you come across it.
Yeah, that is interesting.
But I do think it ties into this Twitter to the anonymity point that you're making, because people will be much meaner if they can do so behind an anonymous wall. His idea that we're going to exchange, or his argument that we'll exchange ideas and think about what the other person has said. I mean, it only works if there is public interaction, right? If people know who's saying what.
And if you're interacting with opinions that actually differ from your own, and you're not just selecting, news sources that confirm your own biases, and you're not just interacting with people online that have the exact same view that you have.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so I'm not sure really how he would get us out of this kind of situation. I mean, given his writing, but I do think he would be deeply worried about the increase in anonymity and the increase in sort of factionalized discussion.
I too am a bit worried about those things in terms of the effect of exchange of ideas. And I guess I want to switch gears a little bit. Given Mill's work that on feminist issues, I would love to know, how the modern feminist movement could be, maybe has been influenced by Mill. It seems like modern feminism wants something quite a bit different than what Mill was talking about. So how would we kind of bring Mill to our modern conversations about feminist issues?
Yeah, so I think his main point is that it's been circumstances rather than nature that put women into the place they were in the 19th century. So that's the big argument that does a lot of work for him, and since it's circumstances, one needs to change the circumstances.
Right.
Give them the vote, give them the ability to enter into the labor force on an equal footing with men, and so on. And then really, I think he thinks that things will work themselves out. And for instance, he says if women can enter the labor market, then their choices to have children will differ radically from what we observe in 19th century England. And he was right on that one in terms of the predictive element. Lots of people who wrote after him objected to that argument and countered that they would just have too many children and the infant mortality rates would go up and so on. But his point was women don't necessarily choose to have 16 children. It's just something that is sort of forced on them. And if they enter the labor force and they're able to make the marriage choice or a marriage choice or a choice about their living arrangements, put it that way, then things would change radically. So, bringing that into the 21st century, again, I think he would suggest that we've accomplished pretty much what he would want to see us accomplish. He wouldn't necessarily want to make, say, special allowances or have quotas necessarily, for women to be in certain positions or whatever. I think he would be, very disappointed in sort of glass ceilings that exist. In his view, you would see a sort of relatively similar distribution of women in lots of positions for which they're qualified than we actually observe in labor markets. And so, how would he address that? I don't think he would favor an intervention to force that to equalize. But I think, again, he would want to see maybe some public opinion doing some work there.
Yeah, it seems like kind of the modern policies that feminists push are things like quotas, mandated, paid parental leave, and those types of things, which, if we think about it from an economic freedom type perspective, actually infringes on the ability for the employers to make choices about who they think is best for the position.
Right.
So that seems very inconsistent with what Mill would.
Yes, and in terms of paid leave, I think he would believe that or forecast that women would want to spend time with their children after they were born, and he would favor the sort of experimentation that allows them to, find someone to look after their children when they're very young and so on. But all of that can be arranged privately. And I think he would just think, that if men and women or partners with children are on equal footing, they can kind of figure out, when the children will stay home with one of the partners and when the children will be in school and so on, or in a daycare arrangement or something like that. I don't think you would see that offers up a huge opportunity for the state to intervene and say, you must have 2 years paid leave or, whatever, parental leave.
It also seems like, as a woman who has some opportunity to choose who to work for, I might, if I wanted to have kids, try to choose an employer that offers policies that are very friendly to that, as opposed to, if you're like me and you actually don't want kids, right, I can have a different set of choices open to me.
Yes, absolutely. And just the choice to have children and then, how to bring them up. That's something very private, I think, in his view. So.
One thing that when you were talking about women's ability to choose and kind of giving them equal footing, it reminded me of a conversation that I had with some of my friends recently about the work of economic sociologist Vivian Salazar, who was doing some interesting interviews about women who now had their own sources of income, and what kind of changes did this make for your life? And what stood out to one of my friends was that she had said she found a woman that said, now I feel like I can make my own choices about, when to be intimate with my husband. I don't always feel obligated. I have my own source of income, right? And so, economic freedom, it has these other really tangible benefits for women's lives that don't always seem very obvious.
Right, right. And he was entirely aware of that, so, and partly through Harriet Taylor, I think, just observing her situation. But, the fact that you couldn't own property outside of marriage was, just a horrible institutional arrangement that he thought degraded both men and women. And you're absolutely right. Once you can be independent, I mean, income is really a source of independence. It's instrumental to independence. It's not so much that the income itself is so important, although it's the means to an end. It's the means to be able to choose. And he absolutely saw that, and saw that both the extremely poor people about whom he's writing, but also an entire half of the population were not independent. They couldn't make choices because they didn't have the money to do so. So yeah, you've absolutely hit on what's, I think, a key point here.
So we don't have too much time left, so I want to give you the opportunity to talk a little bit about what are some ideas and contributions of Mill that you think have been misunderstood? Like, what would you like to set the record straight on? There might be a lot of things, but...
Yeah, so, so I do think his idea of economic progress perhaps has been misunderstood. And I want to just mention that because it's not just, and it has to do with this income argument, it's not just all physical stuff for him. It's mixed up with, what that physical stuff or what that income, if you want to make it in monetary terms, allows us to do, right? And so progress is not, people sometimes see him as kind of having this, all economic sort of notion, but it's not just economic progress or progress in terms of how much we can own, but it's also how much choice we've got in terms of our thoughts, in terms of our abilities to be creative, in terms of the leisure that we have, and so on. So it's a much more expansive notion than just simply, economic stuff that we could produce. So I wanted to mention that. I would as well. I mentioned education last time we spoke, and I want to just make sure that we're clear on that, because Mill thinks education is extremely important and sees a role for the state in requiring education, but he does not want the state to monopolize it. So it should not be the only provider of education. And really, he's talking at what we now call K through 12, the elementary kinds of education. But it is not for him the case that the state should be the only provider. In fact, though he thinks it's all right for the state to provide some, it's dangerous for the state to provide it all. So that, I think that's really important to keep in mind. Then I would also mention, the whole flirtation with socialism, which sometimes gets Mill in trouble because, people think, oh, Mill is a socialist. And Hayek, for instance, Friedrich Hayek thought that Mill went down that road, and many other people do as well. And I've read Mill a lot, more than once, certain parts of Mill and a lot of Mill. I can't say I've read every word that he wrote, but though he's very open to the idea of socialistic experiments taking hold, they would do so only if they still require or have some role for property and some role for competition. And they expand voluntarily. So you and I could form some sort of, socialist arrangement with some friends of ours and so on. We could still own some stuff. We could share the fruits of our labor in various ways that we decide on. But he is not someone who is in favor of a state-imposed socialism. And so it's quite different from how we think of socialism today. He's not a socialist.
I also kind of interpreted those conversations as Mill just taking those arguments seriously and giving them their due consideration, which is entirely consistent with his view on how we should exchange ideas.
Yes, that's exactly right. And, Mill, one reason he wrote so much is he does take every idea he hears or knows about seriously. So then he has to work through, okay, is this one a good one? Is this one a good one? And so on. So you're exactly right. He took the Saint-Simonians seriously. He took Charles Fourier seriously. He took Auguste Comte seriously. He, then wrote that Comte was entirely wrong. And the reason he was wrong, not entirely, but one reason that he was wrong and that Mill ended up being critical of his system is that he said you cannot come up with a single goal for society. You can't come up with a single goal for a person. I mean, we have multiple goals constantly that we're seeking to achieve, and multiply that through the myriad goals that we have across all people. It's just not possible to say, okay, we want 2% GDP growth. That's it. That's what and then how do you achieve it? And so he's very much cognizant of the fact that it having a goal for society means you have to go down an authoritarian route. And he says that's the choice. If you decide you're going to settle on a particular goal, it won't be the goal of everyone. And so to achieve it, you have to impose it on society, on the people who are in that society. So very much in line with then what Friedrich Hayek writes in The Road to Serfdom.
And a lot of Don Lavoie's work, national economic planning, what's left. That's what you just reminded me so much of the power problem. So I can definitely see Mill's influence on the Austrians for sure.
Yes. Yep, absolutely.
So you brought up education, which you live in the United States as I do, and we just got some news. I don't know if you've seen these headlines that our math and reading scores have really plummeted in the past couple of years. What might Mill suggest to do to improve the quality of education, right? We have a system, the state is very involved. What would Mill say that we can do better? And so, this is not just unique to the United States, right? This is something that could be applicable anywhere.
Right. Yes. So I do think the idea of competition would be something he would lean heavily on. And we clearly don't have a lot of competition in the world of K through 12 education. And so, in terms of why those scores plummeted, I'm not sure he would come up with an analysis of those, but I do think that his notion of education is one which frankly would be much more targeted toward a few subjects. He writes, he gives a speech at St. Andrews when he's inaugurated as the rector there when the university opens, and there he outlines, what he thinks education should consist of, and it's fairly I don't mean rudimentary, but fairly tied to some basic subject matters that should be part of a good education, but then also again I would go to experimentation and competition and discussion. He says in that speech that we all are biased in our thinking. Initially, we want to believe a certain thing, and we will believe it until we're challenged, and only if we're challenged will we come to understand that that was a predisposition that I had to be in favor of, this or that, and so on. He's really looking to, improve education so that people who are voting, right, will be able to understand political arguments. And I think he would be worried about reading and math scores because, they're not, if reading and math scores are low and decreasing, people are not going to be able to understand basic arguments, basic statistical information that they're presented by politicians or by civil servants, and that will lead them to make poor choices, and then we end up with in the sort of situation we're in today. So.
Yeah. And so his kind of view on education was very much something that was essential for democratic institutions to function well. Right,
absolutely. And basic education, and when I say basic, I mean math and reading education. Those were important for democratic skills because they're important for understanding, as I say, the sort of whole bunch of information that we get thrown at us. And so, whereas today I think we tend to say, well, education is important for democracy, but what's important is we should learn about social science, or we should learn these other non-reading, non-analytical things, although there's reading and analysis involved. But he would really, I think, focus on, as I say, the math and reading, which, I mean, he read Greek and Latin, at a very young age, so he's way ahead of us.
He's way more ambitious than I think I could ever be.
Yes, me as well.
So speaking of readings, at the end of the Essential Scholars, or the Essential John Stuart Mill book, you do provide a really wonderful list of additional resources for those who might be interested in learning more. In addition, are there any, blogs, podcasts, anything out there that you might want to, give a shout out to that people might want to look into?
Oh, so that's a great question. Well, so I'm an economist. I would, I think Marginal Revolution is a great one to check. I really enjoy that. But in terms of John Stuart Mill, not sure I know of any particular blogs that would, focus on Mill's work so much. Maybe we should start one.
I was going to say, it sounds like a hole in the market that we should get out there and encourage people to go start John Stuart Mill blogs.
Yeah, exactly.
So any last words, any final thoughts that you want to leave us on with regard to Mill?
Well, I'll thank you for giving me the chance. I guess I would just again repeat that Mill is very much in favor of us improving, but the way we improve is we improve ourselves. So we talk to people, we read things, we discuss things with people, and we learn the kind of person that we would like to be. It's a little bit like James Buchanan, the artificial man. We kind of figure out as we go through life, and it takes a while. We don't always get it right, but we figure out, who's the kind of person we'd like to be, and then how to be that person. And we're sort of constantly evolving ourselves, but we're doing it and I don't mean to say, ourselves like in isolation. We're doing it with others, but we're doing it without someone telling us this is who you should be.
We are directing it.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for joining us. I really enjoyed that conversation, and I hope that listeners did as well. I hope everybody goes out there and makes some good and bad choices and learns from them.
Yes, thank you. I really enjoyed it as well.
You've been listening to Essential Scholars, a new podcast series that explores the ideas and insights of some of history's most influential thinkers. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to subscribe and head over to essentialscholars.org to learn more. See you next time.